Without any further delay, let's go into our presentation. The title of the presentation I'm providing is Developing and Using Equipment Utilization Standards. This is a bit of a sort of a top-down view on using performance matrices and performance indices, and those of the people at the table here are of course very familiar with this, and the whole push from the EMTSP program. This ties in, I hope, nicely with some of the work the EMTSP program is doing. We're going over three areas in this presentation this morning. We're going to be looking at developing and implementing fleet KPIs, because that's essentially, utilization is one of the more key things as you look at in fleets, and especially today when we're all under more pressure to make sure that we're are economically justified in the equipment we own and operate. Utilization as a KPI, we're actually going to briefly talk about the passenger fleets as well as the non-passenger fleet. I won't take the time to ask the group, but I do know that in some cases the DOT is responsible for either their own passenger fleet or in fact the entire state passenger fleet. And in other cases the DOT is simply subject to another body within the state that's over the passenger fleet. And then we're going to look at best practices and some examples on using utilization and KPIs. As I say, KPIs are short for key performance indicators. They're performance measures. There's ways of organizations measuring how well they're doing in various areas. Organizations use KPIs to establish performance goals and to measure their progress towards these goals. And in the fleet area in particular, I think most of the folks in this group in particular are in states where you're operating in a pretty decentralized fleet environment, where you've got the districts and the regions are more or less autonomous. And quite frankly, if you don't have a good KPI program in place, it's really hard to do your job as the central fleet function to try to encourage the behaviors you're looking for. So KPIs and use of performance measures are keys to trying to make those things happen. For KPIs to work, they've got to be information's got to be collected and reported consistently. It needs to be communicated throughout the organization, and it needs to be incorporated into the agency objectives by top management. And the best performing fleets I've actually seen, and I guess I'll brag on someone who's not here, at ODOT. In this case, ODOT is Ohio. The fleet managers and the district maintenance managers have their own individual management objectives that are linked to these key performance indices. So when you link that kind of performance level down to the individual, you can actually see change. Reporting, when you're doing KPI reporting, whether it's utilization or other things, it's important to recognize that not all areas are the same. I hear in talking with you folks privately, we all know that you've got rural districts, you've got urban districts, you've got districts that have altitude, that have climate issues, and you want to compare apples and apples. And when you're not comparing apples and apples, people just don't feel like they're being treated fairly, and they just blow it off. So it's important to try to, when appropriate, include performance level groupings. To be effective, users need information and the ability to influence these KPIs. You make me responsible for a KPI that I've got no ability to influence, and you're just frustrating me. So it's important that you give them the information, that they have the ability to influence these KPIs. And when you're developing KPIs and any kind of performance measures for your organization, it is important to include your field people in these operations, because there's nothing any more frustrating than just getting another missive from Mount Olympus that you're being expected to try to deliver on. If you want folks in the field to take ownership of these kind of performance measures, they need to be part of the process. So that's sort of a general overview of the KPIs. Let's look at utilization as a fleet KPI. Utilization is one of the more common fleet performance measures, and we use it in a variety of ways. You folks, I'm sure, are looking at miles, engine hours. Some DOTs actually are looking at the volume of trips, and then in some cases, especially for the DOTs who have maintenance systems where they're actually tracking the work performed, they're looking at hours billed or otherwise the hours of equipment is assigned to a project. You know, the classic case in this situation is you got an attenuator truck. It moved 10 miles today, but it was on that project 8 hours. So it's important to recognize that if you're looking in a vacuum at just miles or just engine hours, you can get misleading information about your fleet. So you need to make sure that you're measuring the things that are appropriate to the equipment that we're discussing. It's important at any KPI that data be measurable and objective. It's hard for me to feel responsible or take ownership for something that is just responsible for, you know, how somebody else thinks, you know, rather than what something that's measured, because that's hard for me to trust that, and I think it is for most people. And the bottom line is why utilization is important in fleets. The more you use equipment, the easier it is to justify using it or to owning it. If you don't use it much, it's hard to justify owning it, and if you don't need to own it, then you shouldn't own it. If you can't use it, then you don't need it. So let's step into the passenger fleet utilization a little bit. Just as a quick sidebar, I'll let you know that in the past year I've been involved in 4 projects of right sizing exercises. One for the state of Illinois. I'm currently involved with Riverside County right now, and I'm actually at another DOT looking at these issues. If you're not already, you will be tasked to justify your fleet. And the utilization is generally where the rubber hits the road on this information. So it is important that you be watching these things and be measuring these things, because again, if it's forewarned, it's forearmed. If you got your act together and you're doing these things in advance, the likelihood of you being on the wrong end of those discussions is much improved. The way that in most states they have some form of annual utilization. I think that's the way you do it in California here. I know that in Illinois, where I was, there's a central management group that does this. They have all kinds of policies associated with personal vehicle assignment. In some cases, the DOT is exempted from some of these policies. In other cases, they're not. But if you're not now, that you will be at some point. Someone will be sticking their nose in these areas, and you do well as a fleet manager to have a good practices in place there, so you're on sound ground when these things come around. Take-home vehicles and motor pools, those are all part and parcel of the whole looking at your utilization of your passenger fleet. And practices do vary by states, as do the range of vehicles covered. As a generic statement, generally below 1 ton is typically where a lot of the state agencies, the car fleet people are managing. But in some states, I know, for instance, North Dakota comes to mind, where the North Carolina DOT is in fact the state fleet manager for all vehicles. So this is a practice that does change from area to area. When you're looking at passenger fleets, the typical benchmark you're looking at is mileage based, and it's typically based on what it would cost them to reimburse employees based on the whatever they're using for the reimbursement rate. In lots of cases, they use the IRS rate, and typically to develop a number they refer to as the break-even mileage, which is the number where if you don't operate a vehicle this much annually, the smart money thing to do would have been to reimburse the employee. So those are, and in most cases, and in fact in the Illinois project that I mentioned, we did the calculations, we ran it against the state numbers, and the bottom line was for the cheapest, least expensive vehicles they had, it still took about 9,000 to 10,000 miles a year of usage to economically justify owning that vehicle. Otherwise, they would have been cheaper off to just reimburse the employees. And in some states, actually, the reimbursement rate isn't based on IRS. They'll base it on whatever their state fleet costs are. But in any case, the bottom line is it costs money to own these vehicles. And if you aren't using them a lot and you don't have a mission-driven basis for doing it, you really need to be keeping your eye on it. And even if you're not in a state where they're watching your passenger fleet this closely, you need to have this on your radar screen, because sooner or later, the auditors will come calling. And for a reference on a full-sized vehicle like I guess a Taurus now or so on, or an Impala, it's up to 12,000 to 15,000 miles. It typically takes that much usage to justify economically owning those vehicles if they don't have a strong mission-related purpose. So as I said, typically there are exemptions for some of the utilization. Lots of times it has to do with what you have to carry, what kind of tools or other supplies. But in essence, if this is part of your job, or even if it's not, you should be aware that, you know, that other ownership options other than direct assignment can be very cost effective. Pulling cars, using transit, using Uber. I took an Uber in here Monday. You know, it's not a bad deal. It's fine. So switching gears a little bit, something I think probably closer to this group's heart is the mission-driven fleet. And of course, that's in the DOT operations that you really have to start when you're looking at the mission-driven fleet. Your fleet is, what fleet you need is determined by what it is you're going to self-perform. So that's sort of the top level decision, is what is it you're going to self-perform. If you're in an area, urban area where you're using a lot of contractors, you're going to be using pickups and SUVs and automobiles because you're really managing contractors. If you're in a rural area where you're doing it all, you've got your Class 8s and you've got all your off-road equipment and everything else. So that decision right up front of what you self-perform versus what you contract is the top level decision on what you're needing to do with the equipment that you own, and that's going to determine what you're going to be focused on for your utilization. Self-performed activities tend to change over time. Every DOT I've been in, and I've been in 17 so far, these things have changed. What they used to do 10, 15 years ago and what they do today are not the same things, and that leads us to believe that what we do in the future is also going to change. So as fleet managers, you need to be working or staying abreast of what your maintenance folks are doing and what where the agency's going in terms of that whole self-perform versus outsource or contracting decision, because you don't want to let your fleet get to where all of a sudden you've got all this equipment that was designed around you doing certain activities in the past that you don't do in the future, or that you're looking to get out of, and you find yourself in a situation where you got underutilized equipment. And like Chris was talking to me earlier, when those kind of things happen, you really need to be on top of it. And if this is a business you're getting out of, or this is an activity you're not going to be performing, get rid of that equipment while it's still got some asset value to it, and move it into the kind of equipment that investment into the kinds of equipment you are going to use. And another factor that obviously does influence this choice of self-performing versus contractor is just the frequency and the volume of the function that you're trying to do, as well as contractor availability and cost. In lots of cases, DOT does work that they'd prefer not to do, but they simply don't have a contractor base to perform it, or they're simply not available when they need it done. So as they fall down to the only group that can perform these functions, so they have to do it whether it makes economic sense or not. But these are important things to keep in mind. So I think that maybe the theme there is, as fleet managers, it's real important for you to stay closely in contact with your field people and understand how things are changing and migrating over time, so that you don't find yourself fleeted to supply functions and activities that are no longer the way things are working or moving towards. So it's really good to be ahead of those things. In meeting your equipment mission-based needs, it's important to realize that you can own that equipment, which is the most common way for most of you folks. You can lease it, you can rent it, you can borrow it, or you can even, in some cases, contract it with operators. Every DOT has a different mix of these things. I know in Missouri DOT, where I'm working currently, they're leasing almost 1,000 mowers a year for 7-month leases. So they rent a brand new mower at the beginning of the season, and then at the end of the season they turn it back in. And for them, that the economics of the deal are such that they feel like they're saving money, and based on a cursory exam, I do think it's a good program with them. But all of these programs are a function really of what the market is in the area you're in. If you don't have dealers that are wanting to try to engage in these things, or in some cases that the manufacturer is selling everything he can and he's not really pushing the government market, some of these concepts work today and may not work tomorrow, and then may work again in the future. So it's just important to keep those considerations in mind. Your choice on whether to rent, own, borrow, or lease, it depends on, like I say, usage, your internal costs versus what you can get it, and what the relative availability, cost, and logistics are of these commercial options. And that, again, that's all very dependent on your own situation. Generic statements simply won't work for you. All right, now let's look at actually the developing implementation or utilization standards. There's a fairly classic approaches to doing these things, earlier this week we heard about a NCHRP research project where you were looking at some of this stuff. In essence, typically you're using averages, and a lot of the work is related to how you treat outliers and data outliers. And in fact, we've heard that in several of our presentations, the importance and how, that really the 600-pound gorilla in doing a lot of this work is dealing with the data. So when you're working with these statistics, you have to try to figure out how you're going to treat these outliers. Some of the standard ways that people use is to exclude the highest and lowest 10% of the data. Actually, that's a very arbitrary approach, but it frankly works pretty well, especially if you just want a quick and dirty way of getting rid of the noise, because that's what these outliers really represent, are noise. And in lots of cases, that noise comes from the fact that they mixed collects and the utilization data on that equipment last month, so I've got 2 months worth of utilization on it this month. Or that I made a fat-fingered an entry last month and I put a negative entry in. And all those things, you just get rid of that noise by some simple treatments. Another way is using standard deviations to deal with that. And you can also look at the use of median as opposed to average values. Works well where you're looking at data that's actually in the midpoint of the value distribution, and we'll touch on that briefly. And one of the things that don't see used very often, but it's a treatment I'm going to talk about, is using quartiles. And again, this is not a statistics class, but as fleet managers, you're working in a data-rich environment. That's all there is to it. Fleet are a very data-rich environment, and if you're not comfortable working with the data, then you better have somebody with you that is, because there's no getting around it. You got to get down in the weeds with this stuff to sort of understand what you're looking at. You want to look at your class usage passages, usage patterns, especially within a DOT, because within a particular class of equipment, you may see very different usage patterns in one part of the state versus the other one. So if you're trying to set a utilization standard, what standard do you use? I don't have the answer for you there. I'm just telling you that there's a statistical process and a data-driven process. You work your way through these things to try to come up with standards that work for your fleet and are useful to your people, going back to the whole KPI stuff. So you're looking to see whether peer groupings are needed. And then when you go through this analysis, you've got to figure out, what do I do now? Do I have problems with the data? Is it a collection issue? Or my people simply, have I not made it clear how it is we're supposed to collect this data? Or we got erratic practices? You need to create, some of the folks here in the military, do you need to create SOPs so that people know what the process they're supposed to follow is? In lots of cases, that's what we run into, was that there simply is they'll tell the guys to collect their monthly usage data, but there's no instructions to do it on this day or that day or whatever day, or and the practices are all over the place. This is particularly problematic when you're looking at things like downtime. Because am I working on an 8-hour day? Am I measuring weekends? If one district's doing it one way and another district's doing it another way, my statistics are meaningless. I've got garbage for data, and now I've got nothing to make decisions on. So it's good to have good data management, and that generally means good documentation on your practices. And it's important that management be behind these things. When I say management, I don't certainly want the fleet manager to be hope that he's got a program that he's prepared to support and deliver, but he really has to enlist the agency management, because ultimately in a decentralized environment, you got to have those measures out there that essentially the district engineers are excited about equipment utilization. That's something they're interested in. It's something the maintenance engineers are interested in. If it's all left up to you guys to sweat this thing, it'll never happen. That's the way the world works. Best practices, utilization. As I said, fleet and operating units should try to work together in developing these standards. using a team approach with regular reporting and meetings. That's especially important in those of you who are in decentralized environments. You're really managing by influence and by information. So it's important that this be a collaborative engagement, and hopefully once everybody can agree what those measures are, then you make sure that you report on them consistently and that you incorporate them as part of those performance measures for the district engineer or the district maintenance engineer, because those are the guys that really have the ability to influence this information. One of the things I've got here listed in this bullet here about market basket or rental contracts, when you're looking at what you ought to own versus what you ought to lease or rent, how do you know what you should do if you don't know what your cost options are? Best practice would be that you have those options already figured out so that you know whether, well, does it make sense for me to buy that piece of equipment? Well, I don't know unless I know what it would cost me to rent that piece of equipment. I know one of my clients, the Virginia DOT, they maintain over 60 contracts all over the state of Virginia that cover every class of equipment that's commercially available, and they keep those contracts on an on-need, as-needed basis year after year after year, so that the district maintenance engineer in Stanton, when he wants to know, I'm not sure I want to buy that motor grader, or I want to buy that excavator, or I want to get a mower, then he can just look, okay, well, my break even, if I could rented this mower for 4 months, it would cost me X. And really 4 or 5 months is all I needed. Well, now what it's going to cost me on my chargeback program if I get it from VDOT? Well, they can make that decision. They'll decide to either own that mower or they'll decide to rent that mower, because they're spending their money because they're running it like a business. They've got their budget and they're managing their budget and deciding how to spend their money. So that's important, and that is an area where you folks can help, is by developing these rental contracts and having them in place so that the people in the field have those kind of tools available, so they know, or at least can have a better informed ability to make those kinds of decisions. And again, the bottom bullet is just a statement of fact. For these kind of programs, it's important to have a champion in somewhere. I mean, typically the state maintenance engineer, the chief engineer, they need to be on board with these things in order for them to have some teeth. You folks know how difficult it is in your position managing with those folks. If you've got top management behind you, it makes these programs a lot more sellable. I'm going to briefly, we're running short on time and I don't want to run over, so let me just briefly mention a few things here in closing. I do know this presentation will be available for upload after the conference, and I've got some slides here that these charts will be very difficult to read when I get into them, but I would encourage you to look at these things, because this is information that's hot off the press from work we did at the Missouri DOT. They were looking at utilization standards and setting them by class, and they really raised an interesting question. What about seasonal equipment? How would we can we set utilization standards for seasonal equipment? So what we looked at was 5 years worth of data on 6 different equipment classes, and we looked at both what their annual utilization was and what their month-over-month utilization looked like. And I think you might find some of this interesting. And like I say, I don't have much time, but I will touch on this briefly. This first slide is one that you're probably familiar with some sense of something similar. This is the annual utilization, and then the y-axis or the x-axis, and this is age. This is Class 8 plow trucks. MoDOT's got 1,500 of them. And in this case, you see that for every year of age, they average running 375 miles less than they did the prior year. So it's the classic pattern: as equipment ages, utilization decreases. And that's a subject for another discussion on why, but the bottom line is it is what it is. So in a nutshell, that's the pattern that MoDOT's saying. You can see they actually use their trucks more than average. Their fleet average for Class 8s is about 9,000 to 10,000 miles a year on average. And those new trucks are running about 12,000 miles a year. And of course, when they get old, it's falling off a cliff. But that's the annual usage without no month-to-month view. Here's a month-to-month view of that usage. All these lines are simply different statistical approaches to looking at what the average or the median or the usage of these vehicles are. In this case, you can see that MoDOT's usage spikes up in December. In January, February is their highest month. And all of those are the same data set. It's just different statistical treatments of the data. In the case of that bright blue line at the top, that is the average where we're excluding all vehicles less than 2 years old or all vehicles older than 10 years old. So why did we do that? Because the vehicles less than 2 years old, lots of times they're still being upfitted. What about the vehicles over 10 years old? Those are the ones you don't roll until you don't have any choice. So you can see, though, when you exclude those two groups, that's the top line. Look what your average utilization looks like. It jumps a bunch. So that's the reason you have to raise some questions as fleet managers, which one of these things would we want to publish? You know, it's entirely possible with this kind of information that you could have quarterly usage standards, that you could have monthly usage standards that really reflects by this time of the year, we normally have achieved 40% of our total annual average utilization. Your fleet stands at X, or your fleet stands at Y. So these are treatments that you folks, this is the kind of tools you folks can incorporate it in your information. I'm just going to show one more, well, I'll flip to a couple. This is a chart I don't know if you've ever seen used a lot. It's something that it's called a box and whiskers chart, and what it's really looking at is what your data distribution looks like. And this is, again, when you start dealing with data, you really need to understand the distributions. Inside those boxes, each of those boxes represents a month worth of usage. We're starting from July to June. That's the fiscal year in Missouri. So that leftmost box is July, the rightmost box is June. And you're seeing what the fleet data looks like. This is the same Class 8 plow trucks. But look at all the noise. Look at all those data outliers up at the top. And that box is defined by the median 2 quartiles of data. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time defining that for you, but if you, in essence, I would encourage you to look at these charts, because this is some of the statistical tools you can use in trying to look at those things. So in essence, this goes to show you that your usage is all over the map, and you have to, as a fleet manager, you have to understand how to interpret that information. So that chart right there and that chart right there, they're the same exact data. It's just 2 different ways to look at it, but it can give you a very different view of what your fleet really is doing out there. All right, and I am just simply going to touch on a couple of this slide and the next, and I'll be done. This is just tractors. This is our mowing fleet. And we were looking at our Class 8 plow trucks. Now we're looking at our mowing fleet. And this is the hours of usage by month. And you can see the same kind of data distribution. In this case, you're seeing December through April, they're not used at all. That's the reason they're leasing a whole bunch of tractors. And then you can see that usage. I actually asked them, what the heck happens in October that this thing gets so high? Well, I said, well, in Missouri, that's your last mowing. That's your last mowing cut of the year. So that's the one that we're going out there and really killing ourselves to get that last cut of the year. But in essence, again, I would encourage you to look at these charts. I think this is some good benchmarking information for you. I'm very pleased that the Missouri DOT allowed me to share this information with you folks. They're doing some interesting things out there. And just like you guys, they're just basically trying to improve their operations. So,
all right. Well, thanks, Henry.
Thank you.
The preceding video was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found at tsp2.org. That's tsp2.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.